Did you know that at least 55% of Americans don't feel like their current pay can cover the cost of inflation? Similarly, at least 45% of these same American workers believe that they are not paid fairly at work. Now, it gets harder when we see that 40% of Americans have had trouble paying for medical care, housing, food, and other utilities between 2021 and now, despite having full-time jobs, whilst almost half of the American population confirm that they have zero retirement savings, and 63% do not have just $500 of cash to handle emergency expenses. On top of that, 4 in 10 Americans say they have at least one side hustle apart from their main job, so that they can make more money to help make ends meet. In the words of Heather Bushy, an economist with the Washington Center of Equitable Growth, the American economy is growing, but why are the people not feeling it? See, when adjusted for inflation, the American wage has literally remained the same over the last 50 years. Yes, the minimum wage had increased in the last 50 years. However, despite earning more than 2/3 of American workers confirm that inflation has outpaced every salary gain they have made across this period. However, this gets sadly interesting when you realize that inflation is not the only culprit.
But this situation goes far beyond.
The federal minimum wage has actually remained stagnant at $7.25 per hour for the last 12 years. However, on the flip side, the inflation rate in the US has increased from 3.2% in 2011 to 8.3% in 2022, and it's frightening to consider when we see real-life examples of these statistics at play. My friend's family is a perfect one to look into. According to him, when his parents were a young couple in the 1960s, they could buy a house for less than 25% of their salaries, and at the same time, they owned 2 cars while putting my friend and his younger brother through college, all on a middle-income salary. But you know what? That dream is almost non-existent in today's reality. An average American is not even getting paid enough to afford the basics, talk less of these luxuries. In other words, as we discussed in one of our previous videos, the American middle-class dream has gradually disappeared, and millions of Americans are now bordering poverty laced with endless debts. Ironically, this isn't evident enough, primarily because the American poor still have access to cheap, mass-produced goods, as every American does. Although, in the grand scheme of things, that doesn't mean that they can't access what matters most. Take housing, for example. Low-income households are more likely to rent their homes and spend a higher percentage of their earned income on housing. Sadly, the rent prices have increased across America by an average of 9% each year since 1980. Do you remember the popular financial hack that said that to stay financially healthy, you must not spend more than 30% of your income on housing? Well, Americans must be a joke right now, because that definitely can't apply to them. To actually achieve this, an average US worker needs to make at least $21 per hour to afford a modest 1-bedroom rental home. Now, do you remember what the minimum wage is? $7.25 an hour. The same madness, part of my use of language, happens across several other necessary expenses. Health, food, childcare, the list is literally endless. The cost of health insurance premiums continue to rise, making health insurance harder for low-wage workers to afford. The average premium for families increased 22% over the past 5 years, yet minimum wage hasn't moved a bit in 12 years. What about food? My friends, let's not even go there. And you know what? For far too long, we have blamed automation and globalization as the primary causes of this pandemic of slow wage growth that has plagued America. However, recent events have exposed this to be an innocent spot that has unfortunately been wrongly accused all along. What am I really saying? Check out the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Great Resignation. A recent survey from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics reveals that at least a quarter of private sector businesses in the US of A, employing a total of 54 million workers, all increased their wages because of the pandemic. So are we really going to still blame globalization and automation? What about the bad government PR the politicians use as the reason Americans aren't getting paid enough? This PR seemingly gets more popular the closer elections come, and silence rents the air again as we draw farther from it. It's a bit of a circus, isn't it? Politicians pretend they care, accuse the present government of not caring, win the elections, and then start doing the same thing they preached against. So this brings us to ask, why exactly are Americans not paid enough? What is holding one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest, country globally from paying its citizens rightly? And mind you, it's not just inflation. Let's begin with the corporate taboo many hate to discuss: their salaries. Previous generations have been programmed not to talk about their salaries. And while the generation of new workers now, Gen Z, are somehow revolting against this, the narrative is still pretty strong. I recently published a video talking extensively about why this is happening. Check the description box to watch it. Now, away from why we must not talk about our salaries, one of the major consequences is that it robs workers of leverage when negotiating. I can't talk about what I don't know. I can't take advantage of information that's hidden from me. So, even if I write that email and forward it to my employer, my chances of getting my desires are incredibly low because I might be negotiating wrongly. And when my employer eventually budges and increases my take-home pay as he deems fit, the chances of it being far below my actual worth are mind-blowing.
Well, I know you weren't.
And inflation is making matters worse. My employer has increased my salary, so I can't grumble. I have to get the job done. However, my quality of life is still not better. I can't achieve my financial goals despite enjoying a pay increase. So, you see the chain. First, it begins with the silence about salaries, which robs the average American of their leverage to negotiate, and then the inflation deals the final blow, ruining every chance of financial freedom. Now, this may sound logical, but if you look far beyond this surface, you will see something even more devilish that has eaten wildly into our roots: corporate greed. In this context, companies are still sitting on cash, but still won't raise their wages. And they know you don't know what your colleague is earning, so they're safe from your disturbances. Problem solved before it even arose. Smart forward thinking. Listen, American business leaders and HR are fully aware of these financial issues, yet they aren't moved to raise wages. I mean, why should they? They've made us believe inflation is affecting their business and they can't make as many sales despite the cost of production skyrocketing. But is this actually true? Well, let's look into the numbers, using Apple as an example. In 2018, Apple announced that its quarterly revenue grew to $61 billion while generating $13.8 billion in profit. That means for every dollar you spend on an Apple product or service, 23 cents goes straight into their bank. In that same year, the inflation rate only increased by 0.31%. So the big question is, where did all this money go? What is Apple doing with this money? Well, it's pretty straightforward. They're returning it to the shareholders. The company announced it would distribute $210 billion to shareholders through stock buybacks and increase its dividends as well. So congratulations if you own Apple stock. You must have gotten a good return in that year. However, if you're an Apple employee, you most likely did not see a thing. By the way, as of 2018, Apple had about 80,000 employees. Therefore, if an average Apple employee made $100,000 per year, which is pretty high, Apple could give them all a 5% raise and it would only cost the company $400 million per year, which is less than 0.2% of the cash the company is using for stock buybacks. But I guess maybe the employees don't really matter after all, or maybe they matter less than the shareholders. Corporate greed at play? Well, to put it as it is, in 2018, Apple management believes it is better for the company to return cash to the shareholders, thereby enriching its stock price, than it is to invest in the salaries of its employees. See, to be honest, I'm not saying Apple is underpaying its people. In fact, they're paid pretty well. As of the first quarter of 2024, the average annual pay for an Apple employee in the United States is $74,619 per year. So the point of my analogy is to examine how management is thinking. The greed that has eaten into the corporate world that doesn't make them think first about their employees when the company is flooded with profit. It's probably safe to say American companies don't see their employees as an investment, and we probably won't be far from the truth either. And things now get more perspective when we realize who the management is. Well, the 1% of the 1%, I guess. So yeah, I hope you get the point. Anyway, the fact remains that Americans are one of the hardest working people globally, and more families across the US are working around the clock, but yet can't afford luxury. Everyone can see that wage increases are long overdue at this time. It shouldn't really be a topic of debate anymore. It's time for a reasonable change at the federal level. And of course, not a change used as a political weapon to win elections. One that is actually genuine from a place of love for the American workforce. Love for the people. The benefits this would have to individual workers, the community, and even these same businesses clearly outweigh the challenges that may arise. One of these challenges is the sticky wage concept, which of course we'll discuss in another video one of these days. But overall, we should be willing to speak far louder than we are now. This conversation, beyond advocating to drive applicable change in the American wage system, would also lead to several other questions, including, but not limited to, what exactly it means to live and the quality of life every American should at least have access to without having to work their socks off. I'll leave you with a statement from Jennifer Klein, a Yale labor historian, when talking about the poor wages Americans are subjected to and the resulting bad quality of life, worse than the generations before. People are working hard, but they aren't actually making a sufficient wage, and they're certainly not getting the kinds of benefits that an earlier generation got. They are saying how disrespected they feel at work.